The following was recorded in front of a live studio audience at the Studio 21 Podcast Café. This is the United Podcast Network.
Want to shake up your small business marketing? I mean, really shake it up.
Studio 21 Podcast Café.
Have you been thinking about doing your own podcast?
Studio 21 Podcast Café.
Would you like to take your business to the next level?
Studio 21 Podcast Café.
This is the golden age of podcasting, and it's time to stop thinking and start doing.
Studio 21 Podcast Café.
Get your message heard 24/7, 365, over and over again.
Studio 21 Podcast Café.
Welcome to the 21st century.
Welcome to the Studio 21 Podcast Café.
Here's the creator and host of the Studio 21 Podcast Café, David Garofalo.
Welcome everybody to the Studio 21 Podcast Café. This is a 21-minute or less weekly podcast to help you get your message out, grow your business, and build your bottom line. Let me help you bring your marketing and advertising into the 21st century. My name is David Garofalo. I've been doing podcasting since 2010 and created a six-figure income from doing a podcast all by itself. This is a 21-minute podcast or less, so let's start the clock. And here we go. Today's topic: finding episode topics for your podcast should be easier than you think. Last week was my 21st episode on the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe. I've talked how and why you should be doing a podcast 21 times. I've talked over 8 hours on the subject, and some may think I will eventually run out of subject matter on this. It's possible, but I wouldn't bet against me if I were you, because I have a trick. I think I can go on forever finding topics about podcasting or anything. I've done about 1,000 hours already on my other podcast about cigars. It's called the Cigar Authority, and I still haven't run out of subject matter on that. I talk 2 hours every week and have been doing so for almost 9 years and never missed an episode. That's 1,000 hours talking about rolled up tobacco leaves called cigars. If I can keep that show going, I think I can talk about podcasting forever, because I know the secret. For some podcasts, the host just runs out of gas, with the host of the podcast overwhelmed every week coming up with new material for each and every episode. But for others, it's easier than you think. But that's only if you're thinking. First off, always go narrow and deep on the subject matter. I'm doing a podcast on podcasting and just talking about finding topics. Nothing more. Finding topics about the podcast. In order to be able to keep finding topics, you can't generalize. You have to dig deep on a subject to find material. People listen to this podcast are listening because they are interested in podcasting. And in particular, the subject we're talking about today, which is finding episode topics for your podcast. If you have a podcast on current news or sports, boy, you have got it made. New content comes out every day, every minute, and all the information is at your fingertips. Just pick a topic of the day and run with it. There are broadcast shows on radio and TV that not only do it for an hour, they have stations that do it 24 hours, 7 days a week around the topic. It's never ending. You should have no problem finding a topic. But let's say you are doing a 2-hour podcast each week about rolled tobacco leaves, cigars, like I do every week. The process to making them hasn't changed in 600 years. There are no new brands, or very, very little. It's a small niche amount of people that even care about cigars. 1 out of 1,000 people use the product. But I still manage to put out 120 minutes every week. So don't give me that I'm out of subject matter. Start thinking. And don't wait an hour before the show to start thinking. Think at least a week before or even a month before. That's my plan. Most people who enjoy a nice premium cigar do just that, enjoy them. but they certainly don't need to learn about them or even want to learn about them. That's my job, to get them engaged and to just sprinkle in the information while entertaining them and giving them some material that's not even related or somehow connects to the very end. But I get the topic discussed through the chatter and delivery every week. And the more podcasts I do, the less chance I have to even run out of material. What? Let me say that again. The more shows I do, the less chance I have to run out of material. So how can that be? Because as I do a lot of shows, I figure out which ones worked the best and which ones didn't. The better ones become annual topics of conversation. For instance, each year I pick out the best cigar of the year. The best come out of the current year's crop of cigars. I call those the contenders for the cigar of the year. I describe 8 cigars that I have chosen and tell about each one. Those are the contenders, and that is an annual show I do every year. The one that comes through should be made and might be next week's show. Wow, I could have been a contender. These are the ones that didn't quite make it on the list, and now we have a second show. Wow, that could have been a contender, and that becomes an annual show. I talk about them and why they weren't. It's another annual show. By week 3, we spend a whole show reading emails, a show of emails of how we got it right or wrong from our listeners. More from the peanut gallery. That, too, can be an annual episode. Later comes the announcement of the cigar of the year, and that, too, is an annual show. That's 4 shows out of 52, and that just leaves 48 to go. We have 52 weeks in a year. That means 52 shows. And the more I can turn into annual episodes, the easier it's going to be for me. Every time I do a show, I think, can this be an annual thing? Can it? We'll dig into that in a minute. But first, it's important. Listen to this.
If you're in the area of Boston North into southern New Hampshire and you're thinking about doing a podcast, there is a place you have to see. It's called Studio 21 Podcast Café. Located right over the border into Salem, New Hampshire, Studio 21 Podcast Café is a live, working, full-service podcast and vodcast, that's video on demand, studio. All professional equipment, professional producer, and total distribution of your podcast is done for you. Would you like search engine optimization for more people to find your business or better ranking on Google? Well, Studio 21 Podcast Cafe can do it all for you for far less than you think. Schedule a free 21-minute no-obligation consultation by going to www.studio21podcast.cafe. That's studio21podcast.cafe. Now, back to the program.
And we are back, and today we're talking about finding topics for your podcast. Should be easier than you think. That's if you think. Every time I do a show, I think, can this be an annual thing? This show that we're talking about, finding topics for your podcast, for an episode show, can this be done again without going over the same content? I bet it can. I know it can. I bet I can, and I bet it will be even better than the one you're hearing right now. I will improve upon it, and it will become an annual show. Finding topics for your podcast. I promise. We will have more information, and then we'll learn more. Looking for topics for your show? Use Google. It's so great. Looking for ideas for an episode on a podcast? Just Google your subject matter, and you're going to find hundreds of things. What are the chat rooms and the Facebook book groups talking about on your subject matter? They're out there, and they're talking about something. What are they talking about? Just look for it and run with it. What are the bloggers and the media writing about as it associates to your subject matter on your podcast? Industry publications, trade shows, meetup groups, what are they talking about? It's everywhere. What's your take on what they said? So you can talk about what they have already said and give your take on it. And that becomes a show. It goes on and on and on. There is no reason to run out of subject matter. I have 2 co-hosts on my cigar podcast, and one week they both couldn't make it to the show. So there was no time to book a guest or anything, And I did a show where I flipped through a 25-year-old cigar publication. That was the subject of the podcast. I flipped through a magazine and commented to the audience for 2 hours about what I was seeing and commented about it. Doesn't sound fascinating? It was.
It was a good show. It was one of your highest downloaded episodes, in fact.
There we go. You know it. It's pretty interesting to glance through a magazine, and I think it was interesting and entertaining for the listeners. Always keep in mind, the show is there to inform and to entertain the listeners first and foremost. But you need to put time and effort into every show, but there's nothing wrong with using the best marketing copy ever written in the history of the world. Do you know what that is? It's one line that grew a business 100% overnight and is still used today, every day. Can you guess what it is? It's an advertising executive that came up with 3 simple word sentence that doubled his client's shampoo company overnight. Now I know you know what it is. Rinse and repeat. That's how simple it can be. Rinse and repeat. Make your best shows, annual shows, and after a few years, most of them will be as easy as rinse and repeat. Now the question to you is, do I really need to wash my already clean hair after I've washed it? The answer is no. But the bottle says so, so I feel compelled to do so. I feel compelled to create annual shows. It will make a podcast a little easier for you, and your listeners will be looking forward to the episode. I hope this got you thinking. Need more help? I'd love to work with you. Contact me at dave@studio21podcast.cafe. That's dave@21podcast.cafe. Schedule a 21-minute meeting with me. Let me show you the studio. We'll talk about your thoughts and your plans, and I'll even buy you a cup of coffee. Next week, I have nothing to talk about next week. No, I'm just kidding. As a matter of fact, 2 of our podcasters here in the Studio 21 Podcast Café have so much to talk about. They love their podcast so much, they started a second show. Imagine a do-over, talking what you learned and starting a new podcast altogether. We'll dig into that next week. That's my 21 minutes or less, and we're out of here. You've been listening to the Studio 21 Podcast Café, live from the Studio 21 Podcast Café on the United Podcast Network.
The views and opinions expressed by the hosts, guests, or callers of this program do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the Studio 21 Podcast Café, the United Podcast Network, its partners, or affiliates.